that, please do have your cameras on. We find it helps to improve engagement. It's always nice to see other people rather than simply be staring at a small circle. So now getting a bit of feedback there. That's good. So now the recording has begun. I will hand over to Fiona and Avi, let them introduce themselves and give a bit of background on what the risk register really is and what we're planning to cover today.
Hi, thanks, Connor. And I'd just like to thank everyone we've got in attendance today. I was just quickly looking through the attendees. We've got a really good cross section from DNOs, from small stakeholders, large stakeholders, customer groups as well. So a bit of background about me. I've been engaged in this particular product, believe it or not, right from the very beginning, but I actually started on the other side. I started as a stakeholder, and at the time I was working for Centrica as the director of wholesale energy markets. So I've sat on the other side, and I was sort of part of the group that was trying to tease out the conflicts of interest that we saw at that time and the unintended consequences. But for the last year or so, I've been at the ENA with the Open Networks project. So I've sort of moved to the other side, put my money where my mouth is, so to speak. And one of the areas I've been covering is the conflict of interest and unintended consequences. So in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Avi, who'll be leading this session and also leading this product going forward. But before that, I just wanted to try and set the scene a little bit for this webinar. It really is what we're trying to achieve here, I guess, is an opportunity for both the stakeholders, for the DNOs and for the Open Networks project team as well, to really focus in on the project's conflicts of interest and unintended consequences register, because in essence, the register is de facto a risk register for the project, and it's here to capture the industry risks associated with the transition that we're going through to a more flexible energy system and a more flexible future. So, whether it's a risk register at the Open Networks projects or within your own organisations, you'll all know how important risk registers are and the role they play in managing and monitoring risks that could potentially derail your business or your project. So in this case, as I said, this particular risk register is critical to our transition to a flexible energy system, and it is our means of managing the risks and potential problems coming down the track. We appreciate that risk registers can be pretty dry topics, so the aim of this webinar really is to try and make it interactive. We're going to try and cover up because we've got people here who haven't been here since the start, so we're going to try and take you through its history, its purpose, and guide you through how it can be used and how it is used as a tool within the project. And as Connor said, we really want this to be an interactive session. So if you've got any questions, any feedback, any observations, please do raise your hand if you're happy to talk, or put it in the chat, and we'll try and keep up with that. It's really important that we sort of try and make sure that we've got everybody with us and that people understand what this risk register is trying to do, and it's been an evolution as it's gone forward. It'll continue to evolve, so your engagement and your feedback is pretty critical. Anyway, on that note, I'm going to hand over to Avi.
Thanks, Fiona. Well, I think Fiona's pretty much covered what we have set out for the day. So broadly, we've set the agenda for the day into two broad pieces. The first bit will be, which I'll cover, that's from point 1 to 6, which will essentially take you through the purpose of the webinar, the history and the evolution, and also how the risk register is used today and its main features. And the second half, the latter part of the session, is going to be focusing on a bit more interactive hands-on session of sorts, wherein we'll share the actual risk register and we can go through them in a bit more detail. So the idea of this is essentially to bring everybody together on the same page, so that while we're discussing the risk register, we know what we're talking about. So that's what we intend to cover over the next hour and a half. Next slide, Annie, please. So just to reiterate the purpose of this webinar, I think so the way we've set it out is to provide a teaching on the Open Networks conflict of interest and unintended consequences risk register, take you through the background, the current uses and its importance, how to navigate the actual register, and how to engage and potentially challenge it if well, that's one of the options, but how to challenge it if we see the need for it. And finally, an opportunity to explore the top risks in detail. Because we have quite a broad representation on the session today, so we have quite a few risk owners as well. So we can have an opportunity to get their thoughts and inputs as well as we go on. Next slide, please, Annie. So talking about the history of the conflict of interest and risk register, it initially came to shape back in 2018. Sorry, was there a question? Oh. Sorry then. The risk register and the unintended consequences initially took shape, the first shape back in 2018 that came out part of a wider ENA and Beringa Partners activity on setting out the future world. And at the time, the conflict of interest and unintended consequences scoped out from a stakeholder workshop in December 2018. So it took a shape of an annexure which went with the future world and broadly captured 6 themes. So we'll obviously go into further details on this. The broad themes which capture the risks and unintended consequences are distributional customer impact, risk of regret, operational viability, system security, system operator conflicts, and market power and gaming. Each of the risks are identified under these categories and have the mnemonics to fit into that as well. So after the initial phase in 2019, the importance of it became quite clear to us. So we then set it out to be a standalone product, and it was scoped out to be as a product 7 in workstream 3 of Open Networks. And to those who are not familiar with the way Open Networks is set out, so in Open Networks, we have 4 broad themes which we cover. Each of them are key to the future smart grid roadmap in the UK. So within each of these products, we have within each of the workstream, we have multiple products which dwell on those topics in detail. So the unintended consequences and risk register is part of the workstream 3 and was product 7. So that's what the acronym WS3 and product 7, you can see a reference throughout. I am mindful of the fact that these slides have a fair amount of acronyms. So if some of them are not accessible, just raise your hands or drop in a message on the chat, and we'll definitely be able to take that up. Coming back to the conversations. So in 2019, this was scoped out to be a standalone product. So that time, the way we set it out to be was this register includes the unintended consequences of the transition to the DSO and not necessarily the DSO model. So going forward, when I say DSO in these slides, I'll be referring to it as distribution system operation and not operator, because that's a key distinction to make in these slides here. So the risk register captures the risks of all parties involved for the transition. And that product specifically was set out to explore risks in great detail and focus on mitigating measures as well. So the key outputs of that product were to be a spreadsheet which would act as a risk register and a tracker, and that was a recommendation that came out in 2020. The outcomes of this overall product would be complete transparency to stakeholders, where they are better informed to take on decisions of DSO. And this register was first shared with the Open Networks Advisory Group, which is an external stakeholder committee which feeds into the Open Networks project in a timely basis. Was on autumn of 2019. Next slide, please. So over the years, we have engaged a lot with the stakeholders and taken on the feedback to make it more accessible and make it more useful. So in 2020, here are some of the key highlights of the input, and which later helped us shape the risk register to what it is right now. So some of the key feedback is here. So one of them where the document is becoming a huge black hole or a dump of a lot of information and a lot of risks, but it's not necessarily accessible to the actual stakeholders with who are legitimate concerns. So that led to an introduction of heat maps, which I'll touch upon in the later slides. So similarly, there were concerns raised that we need to be more careful and mindful of certain communities or underrepresented customers. So there was a recommendation to engage the ENA's customer and social issues working group. So they're the part of ENA who specifically take care of the social and customer issues of the DNO exercise. So we thought it was a very good suggestion. So that's something that's ever actioned in this year as well. Then there were a couple of other, excuse me, so conflict of interest, and open networks taken action to address conflict, but not necessarily engage sufficiently stakeholders, understand whether they're happy with the mitigation put in place or not. So we then expanded our engagement with external stakeholders and set out webinars such as this as well to get the right kind of inputs and buy-ins from the external stakeholders as well. And the monitoring activity only adds value if the follow-up actions are addressed and mitigated actions identified. So one of the concerns raised there was that we have identified many of these risks there, but then if you're going to be addressing it through the open networks, how do we essentially hold track that and keep accountability? So we then introduced a kind of a system where we place the different products within the open networks which address these individual risks, so that the person who's viewing that risk has an understanding and a continuity of where this is being addressed, and if they're so interested, they can then jump into that specific product's publication to see what the key outcomes were for that product. We will definitely reflect that back on the risk register, but for the detailed analysis and understanding, that's definitely a good inclusion to have there. Next slide, please. So as a continued improvement in 2021, there again we've reached out to internal and external stakeholders and try to gather what could be the best way to improve this. What should we stop doing? What should we start doing, and what we should continue doing? So from the external stakeholders, the key theme we received was we should focus a bit on awareness of the risk register and what it's there for, what it does, as opposed to content. And I say as opposed to, not to say that the content needs to be diminished, but then we need to put in effort to increase awareness. And then from citizen advice, there was focus on impact on consumers, especially vulnerable consumers. So as a reflection to that, we've kicked off a refresher webinar, which you're part of right now. And we've launched a couple of blogs and social media engagement via LinkedIn or even ENA website and blogs. Engage with ENA's customer social issues group to monitor and advise on vulnerable customers and impact. And we're also trying to explore explicit links to DSO implementation plan. So this is an activity which is ongoing, which we've initiated. So I'll touch upon that going forward. In terms of continuing what we've already done, the good work we've done is the heat map focus, updated flags. I'll mention what that is in the next slide. And published steering group updates. So what we've been doing is in the open networks, when a product team has finalized a specific product, it goes to the work stream for approval and then the steering group. So it's quite essential that we're able to feed in the inputs from the steering group onto the external stakeholders as well, which we are now doing. And most of our discussion within the advisory group engagement focuses on the mitigation actions, as opposed to generally dumping in the risk register and saying here are the risks. And with the internal stakeholders, the focus was on awareness, and there was a view that the risk register is becoming unwieldy, and we were thinking of making it relevant to the smart system evolution, because end of the day we need to keep it relevant to the emerging landscape of the energy systems as well. So one of the things that came out of it is we stopped the quarterly update and now moved it to a 6 months update with an interim refresh. We have a separate systemic risks which are more actionable, a sub-register to fit in one page. I'll discuss that further in the following slides. And review and communicate interaction with DSO implementation plans, and a refresher webinar and social media, because end of the day, the product team is a identified set of people, but the risk owners can be from the broader external members as well. So it is quite essential for us to bring all the risk owners also and try to feed in or help them understand what this is for and how this goes ahead. So like I mentioned, there are quite a few risk owners on the call today. That will be a good, helpful opportunity to discuss with them. And in terms of continuing the heat map focus published steering group updates, And also in terms of usability, we've introduced filters so that when the risk register is being updated, the user then has an opportunity to filter by risk owner, specific open network products, for instance, or by updated flags, and specific to any other businesses as well. So at this moment, I will just pause and see if anybody has questions, because I've almost rambled on straight through with not much of inputs. Any thoughts and questions from anyone? Okay, if you have to move on, next slide then, please. So where we are, the current position of the risk conflict of interest and risk register as is used today. So currently, the focus of the conflict of interest and unintended consequences is raised by stakeholders and provided full visibility of the activities. And working with stakeholders identifies and tracks mitigating actions as needed. So this is a really important bit, because this is a live risk register. So we track each of them with great care and effort. And that also then allows for a very fair marketplace that facilitates best outcomes for all consumers. So that's one of the key aims of this register. And then ensure that all activities within open networks or external third parties do not lead to any unfavorable outcomes to any of the actors in the energy landscape, and specifically vulnerable and underrepresented consumers, customers out there. And in terms of process, the way we go about it is broadly generic in terms of any risk management. So each risk has a risk rating and a mitigating strategy, and that risk rating could be based on the impact and probability, which we will definitely touch upon later on, and the associated actions. And the risks owner are required to review and update the risks on a quarterly basis. So now this has been updated to 6 months. But anyway, so open networks internally, we have a quality check, and this is represented within the work stream 3 leads as well. It's approved before it goes to the steering group. So there are multiple hierarchical checks before it's finally approved and it's put out there. And the quarterly review, and finally the open network steering group approved before it goes out to the advisory group. So throughout the stakeholder is definitely the key in terms of maintaining the register, updating it, or changing the structure of it even. The register is open for comments on ENA website and through open networks input, any advisory group. The inputs, we seek it proactively, so not to be that it's dedicated for any session. So if and when you engage with this register and you have a thought, please feed it our way, and we'll definitely be keen to take that on board and reflect upon that. Because for the amount of effort and the detail that's gone into the register, I think there is a significant opportunity for people out in the world to use it to their benefit. And it is obviously very useful for us to understand how we can shape that is helpful to you so that you can use it best. So one of that, like heat maps, were introduced for that same purpose. That looking at an exhaustive Excel spreadsheet with so many rows and columns, we have it more accessible in a way wherein we are the greater risks are color coded in terms of red, so they are the higher priority, and green and things like that. So that's the broad process we followed for the risk register in the current scheme of things. Next slide, please, Sunny. So in 2021, these are the changes we've incorporated within the risk register. In terms of process, like I mentioned earlier, we intend to have detailed 6 monthly reviews, which will be in the Q2 and Q4, and we'll dedicate Q1 and Q3 reviews for the heat maps. So in essence, we will be engaging with the risk owners quarterly, but then the detailed deep dive of the register is only going to be 6 months as opposed to quarterly earlier. So we have now initiated an engagement with EN's customer and social working, with regards to risk with direct consumer impact, and we are in close association with them to get their approval on the key activities which we've identified. So more clarity and explore interaction with the DSO implementation plans. I'll refer to that again in the next few slides. And finally, the risk owner stakeholder community engagement plan. So we've stepped up our engagement activities, like I mentioned, with blogs. If you've had an opportunity to read some of the blogs that came out of the ENA team, and obviously webinars such as this, and going forward, we look to get your feedback on how we can best engage with the broader stakeholders as well. In terms of structural changes, so we've now split the entire risk register into two sub-registers which capture the systemic risks. These risks are well, I have a separate slide for that, but just to give a context here, the systemic risks are the ones which are broader in scope and remit, which are not necessarily already addressed by the open networks. So in order to keep it accessible, so we've split that up so that although both remain important, so we then have an opportunity to see which of, depending on the focus area, we can dive into that specific sub-register. So risks are captured by heat map in the register as well. So in 2020, when we introduced the heat map, it was well received. However, for the risk owners who were looking at the detailed spreadsheet, we saw an opportunity to signpost that risk register's heat map back in there, so that they then have a reference of the key status of that specific risk in the risk register in the heat map. So that's introduced now in the register. The risk monitored by the ENA customer and social issues group have a special identifier on the risk register. So if you were to go in, open the register, you'll see a specific column which identifies which of those risks identified in the register are going through to the CNSI working group for their approval and their review. So that's definitely something that's ongoing, and it will continue to remain in place. And then we've introduced filters by product and ownership so that it's easier and more accessible for people, because although like Fiona mentioned, the risk register is for all practical purposes boring. So we want to make it at least usable at the very least. So we have the right sets of filters so that people can filter the kind of key aspects of the register they are keen to explore further. That's the structural change. And in terms of content, we have not had a major update in contents over the status of any of the entries in the register. We have managed to reflect the Ofgem's SCR minded to decision there, because that's one of the key milestones in the evolution that's going to have some sort of rippling effect in many of the activities. And as a part of broader work stream within Open Network, specifically work stream 1A, so we have a focus group set up that engages in key issues on the flexible connection, specifically the active network management flexible connection. So their feedback and their engagement has been captured as well. And one of the key updates from there is in the risk register, we've identified the. Yes, Fiona.
Oh, sorry, thanks. I thought you were going to bring me in at the end. I was just going to add, although we say there that there's no major updates in March, part of the reason for that was under the old process, Q1 this year was a major update. So there was a major update and lots of new things came into the risk register. And obviously, when we then updated it in the next time round, then there hasn't been as much movement as you would normally expect to see. But it's not because it's not been updated. It's just that we've had two deep reviews back to back.
Thanks, Fiona. Yeah, that's just pretty much covered that anyhow. And then finally, we've now kicked off the primacy rule service of conflicts as well. So this is taken under the workstream 1A, but was one of the key activities identified within the risk register as well. Yes, Tim, you had a question?
Hi, just a quick question on the A&M stakeholder focus group. What is the next action on that? I wasn't clear. What's the next step?
No, that's that. I'm just saying that's an update. So we've reflected that engagement with the focus group in the risk register. It's not to say there's an action. There was an action to engage with them, and we've reflected that back onto the risk register, is what I was trying to say. Do you have anything to add, Fiona?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Yeah, so I was just saying, we try and capture into the register the actions that we've taken to mitigate some of the risks. So we held that stakeholder focus workshop, which has fed into a number of the flexible connections at A&M products, specifically P3, P8 and P9. There will be a future workshop, another focus group workshop. We haven't I haven't actually advertised it yet, but we will be putting some dates in to work with stakeholders to review the gap analysis that we've done on curtailment information. And we're going specifically now into that particular product, but this was just reflecting the fact that we've had the first one, but in answer to your question, there is a second one, and that will be trailed shortly. We're just trying to sort out dates at the moment.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. But I think that's purely in terms of the activities within the focus group and the A&M. In terms of the register, like I said, we've tried to reflect as much of the activities we will take on in the open networks back on the register. So yeah, and workstream 1A product 5 is one of them, and that's a key focus of the smart systems flexibility plan from base as well. So that's going to be a key product to look out for. Next slide, please. So broadly, in terms of the actual content of the, oh, sorry, Tim, is that an old hand or a new one?
It's an old one. Let me.
Sorry. No worries. So in terms of the contents of the register, so these are the actual tabs, physical tabs in there. There's a generic instruction and an introduction of what this register is, and the definitions and the ratings of this, which I'll go in detail. There are change logs, and there are the conflict of interest and unintended consequence registers and the sub registers divided to heat maps, systemics, and the open network focused items, scorecards, and the outer scope elements. So we'll definitely have an opportunity to go through these slides more hands-on in the next session. But this is just a high-level introduction because I've been talking about different things. I was hoping to bring that to contextualize it in a fashion that's accessible. This is the highlight. Next slide, please. So in terms of the calibration of risks, impact, and probability, we have the risk impact is the same: critical, significant, moderate, and insignificant. But in order to define these, we've used the Ofgem's components of system transformation actions there. The definitions are going to be feeding into that so that there's an alignment. And in terms of the probability, it's near certain, probable, possible, and rare. This is quite a standard risk register probability listing. So these entries you'll find in the appropriate link or tab in the risk register as well. I'm only going through that so that we are aware of what is in there. Next slide, please. So in terms of the definitions of mitigating categories, so this is where the alignment to the DSO implementation plan comes in. So the mitigation categories: avoid, reduce, accept, and transfer, wherein we can, change the plans to circumvent the problem or put in measures that we can control it. Or we say, accept that there is this place and take in the impact, or then transfer the risk based on, move it on to a third party or somebody else can manage it better. So those are the levels of mitigation actions. And in terms of status, this you'll be, for the folks who are familiar with the DSO implementation plan. So these are the 4 categories we've used there as well. So we are trying to be consistent across so that, these words have the same meaning across products and across open networks in general. So broad categories are not planned for implementation or initiated, implementing, and completed. So these are pretty much self-explanatory there. But then we, like I mentioned, we try to be consistent across. So you will find the same interpretation across different products as well. Next slide, please. So this is a quick overview of how the heat map looks like. So here is on the right, you can see a list of potential conflicts of interest. This is a complete list of the ones we have. So each of them have an impact and a probability score, which then translates onto the heat map at the corresponding locations. So for example, the conflict of interest identified at number 10 has a status initiated, which you can see here, not started, initiated. However, based on the impact and the probability, it sits in red, and correspondingly the risk owner can then jump into to take a look at what the mitigation actions are and update the status. So similarly, you have point number 1, 2, 3, and 7, which are 1 here, 2, and really corresponding to each of this list is here. So this is the heat map for the conflict of interest. Similarly, on the next slide, please. So I apologize, this is not visible, but we'll definitely have an option to look at it in further detail. But just to get a visual representation, this is the unintended consequences list. So we have a complete list of them, and correspondingly, they are mapped on the heat map. And like I mentioned earlier, so the same rating on the heat map is reflected back on the risk register as well, so that the risk owner then has a reference to understand where on the heat map does that specific entry lie. So there's a cross reference between the two. And the same mnemonics is being used here in terms of initiated, implemented, or closed. So these are the lists here, and then on the same sets of likelihood and impact scores that then feed into the heat map as well. Next slide, please. So in splitting up the sub-registers, this year we've used the opportunity to split out to what we call as systemic risks. So these are largely risks within which are prevalent within the energy industry in general. So the idea of that was the mitigation sits primarily outside open networks, which is something we can hope to influence but not directly address it directly. So for example, if the risk owners or the mitigation primarily sit with off-stem or base, for instance, is something we can influence but not necessarily say that we're going to address it completely. So those are the ones we've managed as listed as systemic. So the risks, some of the risks can be very broad and cannot be fully mitigated at all. Then they captured within the principles of the DSO implementation plan. They sit within systemic risk as well. But when you go into the systemic risk, I suppose there's some element of subjectivity there, because if you try to take a call, which best sits where, but then if you were to scrutinize it further, there would be fair amount of, some of them you can think can either be here or there. So it's put out with the approach that, if we are not able to necessarily address it within open networks, we thought it's something that should sit in systemic risk. So then we'd like to get your thoughts on that as well. So here are some of generic examples of the systemic risk we've chosen. For example, market dominance, abuse of flexibility provided, and lack of market liquidity. So that's not an item that we can directly address, because if there is going to be a market abuse, it's not something that we can address within the open networks. And similarly, in terms of third-party intermediaries do not act as consumer interest. So just as an example here, we will definitely talk about this in further detail, but it's just a flavor of what we think could sit in the systemic risks. Next slide, please. So I think that's pretty much what I had to cover, and I'm thinking that Fiona's session will be more interesting because it's going to be hands-on. And I apologize that if my session was a bit boring, but I have no excuse. That's just the way risk registers are, I suppose. So I think now, since everybody's been quiet and really accommodating, if you have any questions, now would be a good time. Excellent. Over to you, Fiona.
Okay, thanks, Avi. I'm not sure if I would agree that this is the most interesting part of it, but it's the part that's more likely to go wrong than the other parts. Can you just give me the next slide, please, Annie? So as Avi said, we've had a number of pieces of feedback from just different customers saying, stakeholders saying, it'd be really helpful if you could just do a walkthrough with the actual register, just to go through. So some things are probably fairly obvious, others aren't. But by walking through, there's an opportunity for people to sort of ask questions. If there's any confusion as to what is doing what, then that would, obviously walking through it line by line to a certain extent will help that. So my plan is to just look at the main tabs that we've got, dip it in, rather than get down into the weeds too far, and just explain how each sort of how the registers work, and then as Avi has explained, we put a number of filters in, and I think the filters are probably in some ways more important because it enables users to zone out the things that they're not interested in and zone in on the stuff they are. So for example, if you're worried about impacts on customers, then obviously tracking the ones that we've asked the Customer and Social Issues Working Group to look at would be, you know, a good filter to use. You may want to look by products. So if you've been engaged in the flexible connections work, you may want to just sort of see where that particular, what risks that particular product's trying to address. But anyway, we'll get into that in a moment. And then I've just picked out a couple of examples where I think it might be helpful to walk through. And then obviously, if it's of interest, then it's an opportunity for people to say, you know, can we have a deeper dive on this particular one? This is one that's of more interest, so it might be the vulnerable customers, it might be the flexible connections, whatever. We have got quite a number of the risk owners on the line today, so that will be an option, an opportunity to examine, you know, what mitigation strategies are in place and what the actions are and how we're progressing to date. So, you know, ideally we'd like that to be interactive. You know, I'd like us to be challenged, you know, to a bit of feedback on what we've done. But before we get there, then I'm going to do the dangerous bit and try and share my screen with the actual spreadsheet on. Moment. So hopefully, is that shared? Great. So as I said, I'm just going to quickly go through each of the tabs. Please stick your hand up, and if you want to ask any questions. But essentially, the first tab is what you would expect to see. I guess it's a one-page guide to how to use the risk log. So it explains the background a little bit. So I'm not intending to read this out line by line, but it's a bit of what we've sort of covered. It covers the introduction. It tells you where to find the important definitions for each of for using the risk register, and it talks about the processes and how we update it. It tells you how you can send comments into open networks if you want to give some feedback or ask any questions. And along the right hand side, you'll see there are links to each one of the tabs. So if you want to know more about the register or more about the Open Networks project, there's a tab there that will take you to the Open Networks webpage. If you want to look at the conflicts of interest or you're interested in the ones that are systemic versus the ones that are more within the remit of the Open Networks project, again, there's these tabs here, these links here that will take you straight to those tabs. So that's all it is. It's fairly straightforward. Ratings and key definitions, Avi's already covered that, but on this page you'll find all the ratings we're using, the different keys that we're using and the definitions of those. So if you've forgotten, you know, what does critical mean, then obviously you can see how that's calibrated on this page. The change log is a fairly typical change log, so you can see right from the start here. Back from whenever it was, it became a product. Obviously, as updates have come through or the processes have changed, then these have been approved or rejected and added into the spreadsheet. So you can go back and look at what's happened to date. So you'll see the most recent ones really refer to we broke out the systemic risks, we've updated the risk register this quarter and that's been approved, etc., etc. So you can see over time, really, this is the sort of captures the evolution over the last couple of years. And then I'm going to whiz through some of these because Avi's already taking you through, but essentially, you know, if you're wanting to use this risk register and you haven't got a lot of time, you just want to know, you know, where the key areas are or where to look, then I would sort of suggest that you look at this page, look at the red risks or the risks that might be of interest, and then you can dip into the more detailed content later on. But if you just wanted to know where we are on the top risks, then the intention of the heat maps is that will do that for you. Obviously, if it doesn't, then that's useful feedback that we can dig in. It's a bit acronym heavy. We've tried lots of different ways of displaying this with pretty pictures for each one. It just becomes unwieldy trying to manage it. So I'm afraid it's not particularly pretty, but it does what it says on the tin, I guess. So now I'm just going. You can see along the bottom here we've got a few more tabs. So as Avi explained, the conflict of interest were one tab and the unintended consequences was another tab, but we split those out now into systemic risks and risks that are a primary focus for the Open Networks project. So if I just these two here, and then we have the same for unintended consequences. We have heat maps, we have the project risks, and we have the systemic risks. Just going to move Abby out of the way. And we have, we'll come to it in a moment, a scorecard and the out of scope risks. So just moving on to the actual conflicts of interest. Let's move it across. So I'll just increase the, people can see that. Okay. So just running across the top, usual stuff that you'd see in a risk register, you have a reference number. We have a tab here to say, was it updated since the last revision? Because prior to that, people had to trawl through and try and work out if anything had changed. So obviously, if you're reviewing the risk register and you've not been in since the last quarter, this will flag that it's been changed since the last review. So on a quarterly basis, we will flag whether anything has changed. We also capture, as Abby mentioned, is this a safeguarding risk? Is this something that we ask the customer and social issues group to look at? In this case, it's not. But again, there's a filter there to try and look at what they might be. In fact, if I go, the next item then across is just really a description of the conflict. So what is the potential conflict of interest on this one? And as I said, I'll walk through a couple of risks in a minute, so I won't go through the detail here, just go through the headings. And then once we've gone past the heading, then it's the description of the impact. What is the impact associated with this conflict? So if let's move across there. So on this one that we were looking at, it was the DNO bias. So what's the description? This describes what the impact of that particular conflict of interest materialising. Who's got the most to, then we talk about stakeholders. So who's got the most to gain? Who's got the most to lose? And then the next column really is stakeholder input. So where we've had input from stakeholders, either through direct communication or sometimes through the PID, we've captured the main ones. And as it happens, Abby mentioned this earlier on. So this is one where we've flagged that we have had that stakeholder focus group, and that's fed into this particular issue. The next few is what you'd expect. It's what's the likelihood, what's the risk. Again, you can do filters on all of these. So if you just wanted to filter out significant or whatever, you can. And as we also mentioned, we've added this heat map column to determine. So you can filter again to filter out, if you like, the red risks versus the amber risks, or however you want to sort of look at it. The next column really just says, when do we expect, what is it like if this was to happen, in what time period? Is it in ED1 price control period, or is it more likely to be in ED2? It's just a rough indication. And then the next section really is about development and what did we consider with stakeholders and with the DNOs in terms of for this particular conflict, what areas should we look at? What ideas might provide insight. So this just really captures the sort of conversations that then went on in terms of trying to come up with a mitigation strategy. So these are the ideas at the time. Again, fairly self-explanatory. The next column really is, when was it identified? So this gives you a feel for how long has this issue been in play. Obviously, from an Open Networks project, if things start to be on here for several years, then obviously that's an area where we'll do a deep dive to understand why is it right that it's taken a long time, or other things we should be doing. And then the next column really tries to identify the owner, and I guess this is where it breaks from tradition. So normally you would, if you had a risk register, best practice would be to have one owner, but some of these risks are so broad, and we have a number of projects delivering different aspects. So that's why you'll see usually there are more than one stakeholder. There'll be different products offering different solutions to different aspects of the risk in play. So as an example on this one, we've got the common evaluation methodology, we've got the pilot projects under TEF, we've got Ofgem's decisions on the SCR, all playing into this particular risk. So the next couple of columns really are about timing. So this progress made towards resolution, this is, has it started? What point are we in? So there's, I think the categories are, it's not started, it's been initiated, it's implementing, or it's closed. And so Avi's already been through that, but that's where you'll find its current status. If there are any key dates that might be of interest to people, they're captured in the next column. And then arguably I would say the next column is really the bit that's is most interesting. So, what is our mitigation strategy for this particular risk? What are we trying to do? And again, we try and identify it against, try and capture them in terms of avoid, accept, avoid, reduce or transfer. So the vast majority tend to be either what are we doing to try and avoid the risk or reduce the risk. And just getting to the end now, but essentially we then try and put in an estimated timing for full deployment of whatever the particular activity is. And for most of the risks, we try and identify, post-mitigation strategy. If it's successful, where does the risk get to? So, a lot of these risks will never get to zero. But if we can move from, to sort of a lower rating, that's where we'll capture it here. And then if there are some comments to be made, that's in the columns block. There are some columns to the right here, which I would say just ignore. So these are to help the risk owners. So obviously a risk owner working on product 3, when it comes to update, they will tend to filter on which ones they have an influence on, and that tells them it makes it slightly easier for them to then go and put their input into the right places. So I would just say, as a stakeholder, you can ignore anything to the right of the main body. That's just really to try and help the risk owners, and Ofgem and BEIS for that matter, to get to their risk quickly and put their updates in. So it's really about trying to make the process more efficient than anything else. So I'm going to pause there. Are there any questions on what I've just quickly run through? As I said, we'll go through an example which might be more interesting than just going through the columns, but this was really in response to people saying, I don't really understand lots of columns, can you just do a walkthrough? So that was the intention. Nope, okay, that's good. Just moving on then, I'm not going to go through all of these. It's the same illustration. This one is just looking at conflicts of interest that we believe are systemic to the industry rather than something that is unique to the Open Networks project. So that doesn't mean we don't monitor them, and it doesn't mean that there aren't activities we can be doing that sort of help with this particular conflict of interest. It just means that there's not really maybe a lot that the Open Networks project is doing, or it sits with somebody else. So for example, this one here, the ID&O revenue driven by demand, so there's no incentive for them to encourage alternative solutions, etc. Then that really is a matter for Ofgem. There's not an awful lot the Open Networks project can do other than flag it, raise it and monitor it. So these are not forgotten, these are definitely not dumped here, but it just helps us manage the risks better, where we can have a much better, where the opportunity to move the dial is much higher than it is for some of these where we may not be the owners or it's systemic to the industry. I'll move swiftly through the next one. So this is the heat map that Avi's just discussed. I won't go through all of them, but again, it's just a way of getting to the important ones quickly, rather than having to trawl through the main risk registers. So, you know, the ones on the top here are suboptimal dispatch, issues, issues with connection timelines, issues with conflicting signals between the ESO and the DNO. Just give me some examples, but obviously they're pretty material, so that's why you'll see them in the red ratings. The next two tabs are virtually identical to the conflicts of interest tabs. It's the same approach with the columns. The only things that are slightly different is we talk about what is for unintended consequences. It's more about what is the bad outcome we're trying to avoid, how does it come about, and who experiences the consequence. So just slightly different to the conflicts of interest, but it's the same thing. What are we trying to avoid? What's causing it, and who gets impacted, basically. And the only other thing to note is, Avi mentioned there were 6 themes. So whilst there are only about 10 or 11 conflict of interest, there's 33 unintended consequences. So they were broken out into the themes that Avi mentioned. So distributional customer impacts, risk of regret, operational security, that sort of thing. So you'll see those headings playing on this particular register. And then the next one is the same thing, but these are the systemic ones. And yeah, that's more or less it. And as with the other one, the columns to the right are really for the risk owners. It just helps them get to where they need to get to when they're doing their updates faster. And last but no means least, then these last couple of tabs are, this is a scorecard. So we try and keep a view on what the status is, how many we've got, you know, where they are. So clearly, if we had a lot that weren't moving on after a period of time, then that would be something we'd have to look at. And the final one is, so we talked about the original risk register capturing everything, and the fact that the risks that impacted the DSO business cases were excluded from the risk register, and that was part of the decision taken at the time with stakeholders. We haven't lost those; we've just captured those as out of scope risks in this tab, just to make sure that we have a full transparency on what's happened over those timelines. So I'm going to pause there, and then what I'd like to do is just walk through a couple and picked a couple that I think are the ones where we get the most feedback or the most engagement with. But as we said before, you know, feel free to step in and disagree or make recommendations, or let us know what you like. Recognise that this is a difficult topic, and any feedback you can give us will be really welcome. These tabs to the right here in black, you won't see them on the main one. I've just added those here for speed today. So I thought a risk that would be useful to walk through is conflicts of interest risk 10. So again, for transparency, we haven't edited or changed the description of these risks, because people know and understand them. But as time has moved on, my shortcut for this one is all about flexible connections and the concerns that stakeholders have had with DNOs using flexible connections enabled with A&M schemes, and concerns that they're preventing flexibility markets from developing. So I've chosen this one because I think most people know about the risk and know the background to the risk. And as I said, it's just really a walkthrough to explain then how this risk register picks it up and to what extent it captures things. So we I won't read through this in detail, but this is the issue that these non-firm connections, flexible connections that DNOs use, the stakeholder concerns was, sorry, Avi, there's somebody waiting in the lobby. Can you see that?
I've let them in.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so this was about, the issue here is that there's concerns that the non-firm connections, which serve a purpose because they allow connections onto the network, usually at the moment faster and cheaper than a full firm connection. But the concerns were there is no real accuracy in terms of the level of curtailment they can expect, and there's an open-ended risk. So the concern there is that this was it's just a free ride, is the word I was given, for the DNOs, and that these non-firm connections will prevent flexible service providers coming in. The language here is old because we don't talk about this. The way it's described here is a bit different to where we are now today because things have moved on. But that was what the concern was, and the main issue was, of course, that distribution system operators would be the beneficiaries, and the non-firm connections or the flexible connection assets are the ones that will be losing out. So in terms of headings like likelihood and impact, that was down as probable and the impact critical, and it's obviously a high risk on the heat map because it's of concern to people. But in terms of what areas of development that were looked at, then people who've been engaged in this for a while will recognise some of this, but we've tried to get much better standardisation on the flexible connection approaches across the DNOs, and there's been so the suggestion was that we needed better standardisation across those flexible connection contracts, and that ideally we wanted to see some changes in the connection boundaries, because if we had a shallower boundary then there'd be less need for flexible connections in theory, and that were the commercial incentives that could release capacity, were customers able to opt out of their flexible connections. There was a feeling that maybe they were fixed in those contracts in some way. Some industry participants have said, can we just have flexible connections as an intermediary solution, because whilst flexibility comes online and a flexibility market solution is available, and improving curtailment information and the interaction between flexible connections and flexible service providers would be a good place to start. So they were the ideas that were captured at the time. The timing in terms of when that was identified was December 18. And for those who've got long memories, you'll remember that the actual actions then were with Workstream 1A Product 5, which was looking, it was an all-encompassing product that looked at flexible connections. As a result of that, a number of actions came out, and they are now in 2021, they are now 5 individual products. So we've gone from this sort of overarching generic review and consideration of what the issues might be, and that's moved from that into specific projects. So I guess I'm flagging where people have said there's concerns that nothing happens or things haven't changed. We've gone from understanding the issue to having 5 products actually delivering solutions. So the acronyms here, but product 3 is looking at exit strategies for customers who are on flexible connection contracts. P5 is looking at primacy rules and how the ESO and the DNOs interact when it comes to dispatching and managing systems. P6 is looking at non-DSO options, so this is peer-to-peer sharing or trading of capacity. P8 is looking at apportionment of curtailment risk, so that's trying to make sure that customers on flexible connections don't have this open-ended risk that they could be curtailed 100%. It's unlikely, but in theory that risk exists. So this is about product 8 is about trying to manage that risk more fairly across the different actors. And product 9 is quite a big product, looking at curtailment information and how that can be improved to meet stakeholders' needs so that they can make the right commercial decisions on these flexible connections and manage them better. The other products in this area, just moving down, are product 4, which was looking at the commercial arrangements and coming up with a common contract method, and P1, which is the common evaluation methodology, which is all about trying to identify or be transparent about how networks make decisions. So when they make a decision on whether to reinforce or whether to tender for flexibility, this sets out the processes. So just moving on, so in terms of the status of this project, it's initiated. Obviously, it's sort of a hybrid really, because the activities going on in flexible connections are initiated, but obviously the work on commercial arrangements and the common evaluation methodology are actually in implementation. So it's sort of a straddle between the two, depending on which product you're looking at. And then the next columns really are trying to capture the key dates of when some of these activities and some of the deliverables coming out of the products. So you'll see the common flexibility agreement dates in there, the CEM implementation, dates when the DNO is committed to creating, committed to using flexibility ahead of reinforcements. And then the last column here is really about the mitigation strategy. I guess in terms of logic, it would be more logical to look at that first. But this is a mitigation strategy. So, you know, what can we do to avoid this issue happening in the first place? How can we reduce it? And you know, the actions we've just discussed really cover that. So in terms of avoiding the problem in the first place, then all the DNOs and the TOs have said they will commit to looking at flexibility ahead of reinforcement. And the 6 steps to that have been published. In terms of reducing the likelihood of the risk, we've got the CEM tool, and we've got the common contract. And then in terms of, again, trying to reduce it, then we've got the activity that I've just described going on in the flexible connection products and the primacy rules and the non-DSO services activity. The next column really just tries to pick out key dates. Obviously, the work on primacy rules has just started, but it gives you a flag there that's now in play. And the intention is that at the end of these mitigation actions, we'll have moved from probable to possible, and with a sort of impact rating as significant, because I guess the risk the impact is less likely to change. What we're trying to change is the likelihood or the probability of this happening. So that is a you know, sort of a whistle top counter through the flexible connections risks. I guess are there any particular risks that you guys want to look at or challenge, or you know, we've got the risk, as I said, some of the risk owners here. Is there any of these risks that you feel you'd like to sort of do something similar, have a deeper dive or challenge?
Was that specifically in regard to that example?
No, well, both. Yeah, if you've got anything on this, that's fine. But if there's something else you want to look at, there's an opportunity to do that.
Yeah, it's very helpful to have an example. My question, I think, is a very high level one about scope. In that, you know, I feel that Open Networks and the Networks project can only do the best it can under the current regulatory framework to put in place helpful tools like this for evaluating unintended consequences and risks. The last week or so has seen 2 things happen that point to disruption. You know, transition, the concept of an FSO from the regulator, and also the power shift report from UK 100 and some of the more ambitious devolved authorities who would like to take more initiative with energy. There's a substantive proposal calling for new powers in order to plan systems, energy systems from a net zero point of view. So my question is, really, would we want to attempt to capture unintended consequences and risks that relate to non-present actors and non-tangible, currently tangible consequences?
So it's a really good question, and at the start of this process, that's where it happened. But I think you're right. There are a number of risks that we could capture in this register. A number of those would be, I think, fairly systemic. My personal focus is trying to identify those risks where the Open Networks project can make a difference and can drive them forward. But in terms of having the whole picture, certainly some of those things that came out of the various consultation documents that came out of BEIS and Ofgem will be things that we need to consider here. As you said, the concept of an FSO is probably a big one in terms of disruption and their ability to do their job through that transition. So the next iteration of this will be coming up in for Q3. So on our radar is, what aspects of the Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan and the other changes that we've been that have been flagged. To what extent do we build those in? And that's probably something we've come back to stakeholders. So we'll have a review, look at what we think is sensible, and come back for views. Because this is it's not just for Open Networks project. This is a risk register for all parties that are trying to navigate this transition at the moment. I don't know if that really answers your question. It's so fresh off the press. We're still just trying to work out what needs to change and what we incorporate here.
Yeah. It's very helpful to have a kind of just that high level response. I don't think any of us would be expecting an immediate answer on things of that nature.
There are a number of hands up, so are you?
I think Ben's the first one.
Hi. I think my point was a little bit covered to your answer to David's question, but can we just sort of outline the steps on how stakeholders can sort of provide their view and have that considered to feed into being covered by the risk register? If there's a particular risk that they feel strongly about, how can they ensure that we recognise that and it's covered within the risk register?
Yeah, so if anybody has got something they want to raise or modify or change, there are a number of routes to it. So one would be to email the address that's in the README tab, which is this, the generic email address for the ENA, and that will then go to forward it to Abby or myself previously for incorporation. Usually what happens on that is we end up having a call to the stakeholder involved just to understand what the suggestion is, or to confirm or discuss how best to incorporate it. The other options available are obviously through the advisory group. So at various sessions at the advisory group, we've had breakouts on the conflicts of interest and unintended consequences. So if people feel there's something they want to pick up there, that's another opportunity. And the third one I would say is a bit of a shameless advert for the flexibility consultation that's out at the moment. Is clearly what happened last year was we got a number of bits of feedback, and we will normally go through that and capture any suggestions. So there may not be direct suggestions for the conflicts of interest, but if we've picked up something from a stakeholder that is relevant, then we've incorporated that. So responding to the flexibility consultations, product consultations, and the annual PID, they're all areas that we then explore and try and extract out where stakeholders have got views.
Excellent, thanks, Fiona.
But in terms of direct impact, just email the project and we'll receive it, and then we can move forward with the suggestion.
Is that a new question? Or...
Sorry, legacy hand there.
Okay. So if people haven't got a favourite risk, I just wouldn't mind going back to one of my risks that I would like some stakeholder feedback on, if that's okay with everybody. So just need to. Sorry, let's try and find the right one. Nothing like using a spreadsheet with an audience. So I'd like to pick up on the issue that Citizen Advice flagged, and we really appreciated their feedback. But there's a lot of stuff that we do on this project is about the transition to a more flexible system. It's all about supporting and underpinning the move to net zero. But the one of the sort of big tickets in this transition is not leaving anybody behind and making sure that the opportunities for the different customer groups that want to play in flexibility markets is there. So this is quite a difficult area to work with. So obviously the issue is well trodden. We know that it may come about because of market design, or it might be that some customers just aren't able to change how they use their network. But it was just this one. Citizens Advice suggested that we engage the ENA customer and social issues group, which we've done. So they've had a review. But this is one area where I think it's one where you struggle with the most in terms of trying to identify activity that the actual program, the project can do. So we're engaging with the community energy forums. We obviously have customer groups engaged. I think Citizens Advice is particularly vocal, and we also refer to some of their documents and principles that they've used previously. It's smart and fair. But I guess the question for me is there anything else that you think we should be doing or looking at in this area? So if you look at the mitigation strategy here, that's sort of what we've set out, but it is quite difficult to actually get some real tangible project outcomes as part of the work that we did in an Open Networks project. So it may be not right now, but I'd welcome people looking at this particular one and thinking a bit more out of the box. Is there other things that we should be doing to try and mitigate that outcome, and what else we could do that might be different?
Just got a question from Helen Stack.
Hi, it's not really a question, but as you, I think some of that's captured in the mitigation strategy, but by making flexibility markets more accessible to residential, including social housing, which is actually well placed to participate. I think that will help.
Okay. That's a good suggestion, thanks. Thanks, Helen, that's great.
Bean has made the comment in the comments just to ask what the situation is regarding prepay meters.
Sorry, do you want to just elaborate on in particular on that?
Yeah. Hi. So it's Dean here from the Heat Pump Federation. Yeah, this question about prepay meters. I've never been able to completely bottom out whether consumers on prepay meters can access time of use tariffs, including even the most basic sort of economy 7 and economy 10 type tariffs, because there's an assumption in SAP about the operational costs of night storage heaters, which in some circumstances seem to us to be completely flawed. If a consumer is on a prepay meter and cannot get the assumed economy 10, economy 7 tariffs for night storage heaters, i.e. they're paying through the nose to run those things. And that has the potential to change the dynamics for social housing when they're looking to displace night storage heaters with heat pumps.
Okay, thanks. That's a good challenge. I think that's one that I think is probably one of the issues we need to capture within that risk, that when we talk about customers who may be locked out of some of these options, that prepay meters may be a barrier to engaging. Regards to specific detailed questions of that, I don't know if there's anybody else on this call who's in a position to answer that. Obviously, prepay meters are part of the supplier businesses rather than the networks. So unless somebody else has got an answer, that's probably one that we would need to push back to the supplier networks, the supplier businesses.
Yeah, understood. But it would be lovely to actually understand the situation properly once and for all.
Okay. So Bays and Ofgem, who sent their apologies for today, have asked for feedback on this session. So maybe it's one when our feedback from today, we can add that to the list of things and ask them to respond back on how that, where they see that particular aspect.
Excellent, thank you.
I'm just conscious of time. Oh, sorry. Hi, Amy.
Hi, sorry, just issues with being muted there. I'm deputising for Caroline from Citizens Advice today, so you'll have to bear with me, I'm brand new to role. But I just wanted to ask, does the Open Networks project have any kind of duty to do deep dives on this issue, in the sense of going to speak to consumers, having any sort of consumer forums or engagement to ask them about, highlighting issues that they have in this area? It might help to design some of the mitigation that you could feed into the products that you have here and going forwards. So
I think you asked, did we have a duty to do it? I don't think there's a specific duty, but it's a very, very good idea. The feedback we had last time was, can you engage the safeguarding team, or it's actually known as the Customer and Social Issues Group here. So the E&A group that looks at these sort of issues has gone through the ones that are customer linked and have sort of put their advice on it. But if that does sound like an activity that will be really helpful, sorry, I'll bring Abby in a second, and having that engagement and going through in a bit more detail would be, I think, a really good shout. Sorry, Abby.
Just to jump in there, I mean, I think going forward in the open networks, as a part of open governance, we're setting up different user forums that are of particular interest to the users, because we've received multiple feedback on that. So the way we have approached it is that when there are key products which have material impact on a specific group of individuals or stakeholders out there, we then have a focus group set up wherein we can feed and bounce off the key concerns and ideas. So at the moment we are engaging with the external stakeholders, but then the advisory group and things like that have a broader remit. So it is, as a part of open governance, we've broken that up into the areas of influence, and we'll pick that up in that fashion. So just to echo Fiona's view, I think as Open Networks, we are really keen to engage with external stakeholders and get their thoughts on board. But I think it's probably misplaced to say that we are required to do it. I think it's more of an initiative, and we are being very proactive that way. But definitely encourage if there are any suggestions on that, if you think you have any.
So I think on that particular one, we'll be back in touch, Amy, either with yourself or one of your colleagues to talk about how we could do that particular piece of work. I think it's a good suggestion.
Lovely, thanks, Fiona.
Just conscious we are hurtling towards the end of our allotted time here, so I think we probably have to move on. Is there anything else you're wanting to cover on this area, Fiona?
Not from me, other than to say, you know, this is sort of the beginning. Feel free to send through thoughts, reflections, suggestions after this event, and whenever you spot something that you'd like to feedback on. I think the very last slide was just one of that set out the dates going forward. No, sorry, you have to go back a bit. Yeah, so it's just I think I'm hoping you found the session really useful. I know it's a dry topic, but it's a really important tool for monitoring progress and making sure barriers get removed. I've captured a number of next steps, which rather than relay through them here, we'll drop out in a note. And the only thing I was going to flag was, the dates going forward. We've got an advisory group coming up in September. So if you think of anything after this session that you want to raise, then just let us know at that session. And then the next reviews basically we've got the Q3 and Q4 coming up, and the next one's a deep dive on the heat maps, and the one after that will be on the risks itself. So we'll be back in touch and with updated publications once they're done. So that was me done, Connor, really.
Just want to check. Is Amy has a question? Oh, is that?
No, that's my hand, so I'll pop it down.
Sorry, over to Connor.
So just in these closing minutes then, it's always useful to get your honest thoughts and feedback on what we have been doing. So put a little link and the code you'll need to participate for the Slido questions in the group chat. There's only a few questions, and we should certainly finish before past. So if you're able to go to that link and enter that code at the top, you should be greeted with a small number of questions. I won't spend too long on this, but it's really good to get an understanding, well, for us to understand what your understanding of this conflicts of interest and unintended consequences register is. 1 being poor and 5 being excellent. I'll probably leave each question open for about 30 seconds. If anyone has any problems accessing it, just let us know. Oh, it's also anonymous. If you are representing the risk owners here today, please, you're welcome to participate in this as well. It's, as users of the register, it's important to get your views too. Okay, I'll leave that maybe 5 more seconds and then we'll move on. Okay, moving to the second question then. It's really around how have you found our engagement on this risk register to date? So They're all fairly self-explanatory, but it's a range from below average, average, above, and excellent. There is an opportunity at the end for a free text field, which I'll leave open for at least an hour. If you have any further ideas on how you think we can improve engagement, or you have any particular comments, such as whether we've been far too in the detail and granular, or there wasn't nearly enough information, or anything in between. Just give another 5 seconds on this. Now we had 11 responses to the first one, we're on 9 for this. Okay, we'll move on to question 3 then, or 4. Very easy one, of whether you think our recent activities have really improved engagement. So these are things like the blogs we've been publishing, the webinar, etc. Just leave that 5 more seconds. So if you haven't submitted, please do. And the last poll one then. So how likely are you to use the conflict of interest and unintended consequence register in some capacity in the future? So 1 being never, 3 being quarterly when we update it, and 5 being monthly. So obviously 2 and 4 would be some duration in between. Five-second warning for any last submissions. Wonderful. So I'll leave this one open for at least the next hour. It's really, if you have any further ideas on how we can make it more accessible, more engaging, please let us know. If you've got examples, all the better. So I'll leave this open till 1 o'clock then, so you can fill out at any point. So that brings to a close our session here today. So I want to thank everyone for attending this webinar. I really do hope that you have found it of genuine use and you have a better understanding of the risk register at this point. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch. You can contact us at opennetworks@energynetworks.org. So thank you all for attending, and especially yourselves, Avi and Fiona, and we will see you next time.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.